Welcome to It's a Numbers Game. I'm Adam Morris here with my co-host Daniel Welling. Today we are joined by Anne Hall, founder of IT Agree. Anne is an expert in MSP contracts and commercial risk and helps MSPs around the globe solve their legal and client agreement challenges via an innovative as-a-service approach. In this episode, we are drawing a clear line between your legal agreements and your EBITDA. And you'll learn how to turn in-scope versus out-of-scope from a leak into a margin protector, how to align contracts, processes, and team behavior so you stop doing unpaid work, and how to set client expectations around third-party tools and liability without scaring off the sale. So let's get straight into it.
And welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here and have the opportunity to talk with you.
We've been looking forward to this for some time, and we're like ships are passing the night internationally and exhibitions. So we're very happy to have made this happen, and really interested, as we were talking in the green room, about really drawing a straight line to connect EBITDA and an MSP's legal agreement. So maybe we could start there.
Sure, perfect. Yeah, so straight in. So I think, MSPs provide such amazing services and, increasingly sophisticated and complex services. But in fact, there's a lot of risk. And while the great services are there, many MSPs who turn their minds to the risks are often nervous about that. So those sorts of risks then can impact certainly their financial success, in turn their business growth, and of course all of that is impacting that critical ratio between their revenue and their EBITDA. So it's an area that I think is often perhaps not considered in terms of how contracts really work for MSPs.
And I almost see the two topics almost running in parallel as well, almost associated to the maturity of an MSP. The less mature, less commercially aware MSPs tend to not be focusing on the financial topics, but equally they're not going to be focusing on the legal topics as well. They're like, if I do a good job for my client, they're going to pay me and remain a client for a long time and everything's great, right?
Yeah, so I think that's true, and often there are trigger points around that maturity level of the MSP. But I think no matter how mature the MSP is, there's often the view that the contract is there for a worst case scenario. So they think, if there are ever, legal proceedings against my business, then, I hope that our contracts will save us. And they may or may not be using contracts. It's quite alarming, perhaps would be the word, as to how many MSPs are not using contracts. And we're working globally, so we see that in all of the countries where we're working, as to how many are not using contracts. And so that maturity level and that trigger comes in where, they've started to grow, they then think they need contracts, but still that perception oftentimes that the contract is there for a worst case scenario. So we encourage them to reframe that perspective and to see the contract really as not only that tool, that, and we hope they never ever need it for that purpose, of course. But if MSPs start to think about the contract as more of a proactive tool for risk protection and really embrace that approach, there's so much less likelihood, in fact, of that worst case scenario ever occurring, and there are a whole number of elements around that viewpoint around the proactive use of contracts.
It's almost the same debate that an MSP might have with their client in turn about something like backup. If you never need it, you question the value of it. Of course, the time you do need it, yes, you're glad.
In this case, it's not only that worst case scenario that contracts should be considered for. There's a whole bunch of risks, and in that MSP's risk landscape, one is of course legal proceedings, and that very rarely happens. We most often hear from MSPs, I've been in business for 20 years and we've never had a problem. What they mean is that they have never faced legal proceedings. Have they had problems? Absolutely. So you look at things like, what are the responsibilities around reselling cloud services? When NCE was introduced a few years ago with MSPs reselling Microsoft 365, a whole lot of new risks came in for MSPs and causing, some additional, layers of risks for them. So those sorts of things, the old in scope, out of scope. And I've been, working in this game around IT contracts, first of all through big law firms, then my own law practice focusing purely on IT law, and then with my current business. And that in scope, out of scope is an age-old problem, and it just does not seem to go away. So that often triggers a lot of areas of revenue leakage for businesses. They don't lead to litigation, but the MSP often steps in there to keep the customer happy and to avoid any, unpleasant conversations, shall we say, steps in there, fills that gap of the out-of-scope work, which probably shouldn't be done as part of the monthly fee, and thereby, that revenue leakage issue appears. So those are just a couple of the areas, customers not taking up recommendations, a risk area again. So there are a number of different risk areas causing revenue leakage, which do not give rise to legal proceedings, and hence the need to reframe that perspective around, what do we think the value of the contract really is? It's not, I've done a deal, now I need a contract, which we quite often hear. That education piece is vital for MSPs to understand a little bit about how contracts work and to make sure they have valid contracts in place, but also to reflect on that, the service commitment and the understanding that their customers need to have around how they work, because if they're just relying on trust, and that is very common, then the customer's not getting that understanding of the service commitment and the basis on which the service is being delivered. And so then the customer relies on that assumption that they have, that they come in with, that everything is included, that the MSP is responsible for everything.
So it's having an agreement, but also making sure that it is policed and there is no early setting of an incorrect precedent, which then makes it harder to then police as well. So starting as you mean to go on, really.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. So even, for site assessments, prior to onboarding a new customer, an MSP needs to be careful about the basis on which they're doing that site assessment and thinking about, what they need to agree with the customer right from the outset. And when I say agree, the way then to put that agreement into something that's enforceable is what we call a contract, right? So you're taking what you want to agree with the customer and putting that into a legally enforceable document. But I think the important element is for MSPs to understand that that's exactly what the contract is. So it's not something that should be full of legal mystique or indeed technical jargon. It should be something that both the MSP and their customer readily understand, because that's what you're agreeing.
How much longer are you going to struggle alone, watching cash flow slip through your fingers, wondering why your MSP isn't giving you the life you promised your family? You didn't start this business just to scrape by. You started it for freedom, financial security, control. Yet, here you are, stuck in the grind, firefighting instead of growing. Or maybe you've built something solid, but you're not ready for the sale or exit you dream of, and you can't afford to get this wrong. We've been there. We've built and sold MSPs ourselves. We know exactly what it feels like to hit that ceiling. That's why we created our mentoring to turn struggling MSPs into profitable, sale-ready businesses. Here's the truth. One MSP grew profit from 300K to 1.3 million in a year with our help. Another small MSP went from a 10% loss to 10% profit in 12 months. You can do the same. Book your free consultation now at mspfinanceteam.com. We'll tackle one issue holding you back and give you clear next steps. No strings. Stop surviving, start building MSP and the life you set out to create. Can you just go into a bit more detail then? And I'm going to pick the in-scope, out-of-scope one because that's a big one. You've already mentioned it impacts leakage considerably. So just paint a picture of here in some detail around the journey the MSP takes when discussing this aspect with the client, the degree to which they openly discuss it at the start, how it is presented within the contract, the extent to which this point is laboured almost, so that problems don't occur further down the road when the client asks for something out of scope.
Yeah. And I think that oftentimes it's not laboured at all. It's a race to, get that e-signature on the contract, leaving...
The tendency is to obviously smooth over, these minor things around price increases and things being out of scope, right? Because no one wants to put a block up front when they're looking for their client to be signed. So there's an inherent tendency just to sort of smooth over that. But of course, my experience was the reverse is true. You actually want to bring these out so that you don't have future problems. But please take us through how you recommend approaching this.
Sure. So you have that initial site assessment, and from there, an onboarding or a proposal for the customer. So that initial site assessment, when you're going on and, having a look at the IT environment for the customer, understanding, their critical systems, what they have at that stage, and, potentially what you're going to recommend they move to. As soon as you're going in and looking and touching, what they have, it certainly pays to have something in writing that's, essentially, I'm going to call it a contract, but that might sound a little scary at that stage. It could be very brief, but it will just clarify the basis on which you're going in. It'll make you appear very professional, and it will give that clarity to the customer. And this is the way that we're going to move forward. So you're establishing that context right from the outset. Then you've got a much better picture from which to move into the onboarding, and on what basis are you doing the onboarding. If that's going to just be wrapped into the monthly fee, it might take your monthly fee up higher than it might otherwise be. If it's going to be a discrete onboarding piece of work at the outset, then that's what your contract needs to cover off. So I think the important thing is that, we've seen MSPs really cover both of those elements without sharing with the customer that, this is valuable work, whether or not they're charging for it. So you can put a price on it and potentially discount that price, or say you're going to wrap it in some way if they move ahead with you. But to come in and do, for example, a couple of days work of assessment, and then, before you prepare a proposal, I mean, how many professionals do you go to who would do that? Sure, there's a pre-sales element, but as I say to people, would you go along to a new dentist and they say, well, we'll do some examinations, we'll do some x-rays, it'll take a couple of hours and we won't charge you. It just doesn't happen. So when you start out, I think set that expectation clearly as to how this relationship is going to proceed. I think that many MSPs would be perhaps surprised as to how the customer would respond to that, because customers, are potentially being left a little in the dark in some cases. And that, trust me kind of model is perhaps makes the customers a bit nervous. So moving on from there are a whole raft of elements which are often grey areas and that need to be ironed out. And those grey areas often come at the cost of the MSP.
And just moving forward from the initial onboarding phase, site assessment phase, into the thick of the actual contract. So the initial work is done. The MSP says, here we are, it's $3,000 a month. This is what you get. This is what you don't get. Just is it that straightforward for you, or is there something more about this that needs to be tackled?
Well, the complexity of the service is, is quite a big topic, and it's not something that can be simply, here is the monthly fee and here's the service. there's what is the service being provided in respect of, what's involved in that managed IT environment, and how do you go about making changes? Because change is inevitable in what's being looked after, shall we say. The elements around what is included in the managed service, typically there's huge dependence on third-party services, which is a really important element. So if you look at, one MSP that came to us and said they had, included managed firewall in their managed service, and then there had been an issue for that particular customer, and the customer was completely unhappy, even though that particular MSP had gone in and remediated really quickly. Now, if you look at that firewall is provided by a third party, and on what basis? If you were to look at the typical contract or terms and conditions being put out by those third-party vendors, and in that particular case, we had a look at it, and the vendor in their contract expressly said they gave no representation, warranty, or an indemnity that the product, which was a firewall, would detect, identify, or disable anything harmful. So if you think about that for a minute, the vendor is not taking full responsibility for the product, far from it. And so certainly nor should the MSP. So those sorts of elements need to be carefully considered. And it's not only the products that the MSP is including in their stack, which are often not made that visible to the customer, to be honest, providing a backup service. On what basis? What's actually behind that? Without, and it's often with contract drafting a matter of, where are the risks and how far do you need to go?
And of course, if you don't limit your liability in that way, then presumably whomever is insuring you, assuming that it went legal and then you required the insurance, wouldn't also, they're relying on you to have the first layer of defense from a legal perspective.
Yeah. So, as I said earlier, if you head into litigation, it's really, a very unfortunate situation and not one that I would wish upon anyone. I think it's inevitably incredibly stressful and time-consuming and expensive as well. And so the approach of looking at things proactively and helping customers to understand that this service is built on a bunch of third-party services which you're not fully responsible for. The MSP is coming in, and it's not the case that the MSP should then be taking on all the risk that the customer inherently has in running a business that's dependent on technology, as pretty much all businesses are. What the MSP needs to convey to the customer is that the MSP is there to support and to mitigate some of that risk, not to take it all on, And so I think that if customers can begin to understand that, as a position from the MSP, then it really helps the relationship. And so you simply don't get to those sorts of situations so long as your contract is there supporting that position as well. Okay.
And of course, baking this into those early educational conversations with the client then actually supports the elephant in the room, which is price and how much should, we've included this lower priced firewall option. There are higher priced options which may or may not provide or afford a different level of protection, but the client is making that conscious decision along with the support from the MSP. I don't want to not have a firewall, but I can't afford the best firewall. So talk me through what the options are and ultimately find that right balance between what the client is prepared to spend and what risks they accept they take on as a result.
Absolutely, yes. So, and I think, another important element is around the living and breathing of the contract. So what I mean by that is, you could have the best contract in the world, but if your team is not behaving in a way that's consistent with what's in that contract, it's not going to help you in anywhere near the same way. So if you then, have your team, still potentially handling out of scope tickets at no additional cost, or handling projects, even though they might be small projects, as part of the managed service when they should not be, that is not going to support your cause in getting together contracts that actually can support a reduction in those areas of revenue leakage. So it's about having your agreements and your processes in sync. And that doesn't mean team members need to study the contract. It just means they need to be working in a way that's consistent with what's being agreed.
Absolutely. And again, this all feeds into that level of maturity that the MSP is exercising across, the control they have across their whole business, from operations, sales, account management, commercial.
I was just going to say, for me, this component around educating your team spills over into the account management team to educate the client on an ongoing basis.
Mm-hmm.
Don't think it ever stops to some extent. And it's alongside the education of the technology and the roadmap, whatever else, is also the education on, just so we're clear, you don't get this included in your all-you-can-eat managed service. This is outside of scope. The printer to be installed isn't free of charge. That's that's called an installation or a new.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a good habit to get into where you're kind of bringing the client on board with that education. You're working in part, you're explaining them from the outset, this can be confusing. It is complicated. It does change. So it's an ongoing kind of process to keep the client kind of involved in that from a partnership approach. It's like, what we're looking to help each other here. We're looking to remove ambiguity. We're looking to, and that's of course where it also then spills over into the budget planning, I suppose, as well, because hang on a second, Adam, I thought this was an all you can eat. Well, it is, but nothing's all you can eat, right? And you're changing your business all the time, and there's new costs coming in all the time. So we need to make sure we are building a budget appropriately to plan for that. And I think that's where it kind of comes full circle to some extent alongside the legal piece.
Yeah. So you mentioned change there a couple of times, Adam, and you get change, of course, in what's going on with the customer and also in what's going on with the service. So contracts need to be able to work with changes of all sorts, and you don't want to have to necessarily put new contracts in front of customers every time you make a change of some sort. That said, there are certainly times when you would need to, if you've got different types of services that you're adding. But the contracts need to reflect that reality of change, and change of many types. I did mention just then about contracts for different types of services, and I think that's also really a really important topic, because gone are the days when one contract or one set of terms and conditions could be suitable for the range of services that MSPs are providing today. So we've obviously got managed services, but let's face it, many of them, have not got all of their customers onto the monthly managed service plan. And so they'll be providing support in other ways as well. And even though there might not be fixed term contracts as such required for those other services, if you're providing reactive services, to a group of your customers, then you certainly want to have contracts in place for that as well. Again, if you think about what the customer might be assuming and expecting when you're providing that more ad hoc support, you want to really tidy up on getting those expectations, more aligned with what's actually going on. But, that's a simple kind of situation. If you've then got, leased lines or other types of internet services you're reselling to the customers, that's a completely different type of contract that's required. If you're reselling 365, as most are, sometimes MSPs are putting that into their managed service as part of the stack, but probably more often not. So that whole reselling activity especially with Microsoft 365 under MCE, needs a specific contract to protect against, to help communicate how that actually works in a contractual context, but also to protect. Yes.
Do you see differences across your global estate in terms of how bundles are implemented? So, for example, if you include a Microsoft license within your service, then certainly I see some people advocating that absolutely, and others no, it should be separate. But we do want to provide guidance around which subscription to have, so whether it's standard or premium, and of course over time this will change because Microsoft are continually evolving and changing their platform. Yeah, how do you see that differentiation across the estate?
Yeah, so I think, in the US, they tend to have a far more included in their stack than in the UK, typically. Yeah, so we do see variances, and I think we're seeing more now a stronger level of cybersecurity being, in effect, mandatory in the managed service, but still those MSPs wanting to clearly delineate that cybersecurity service as part of the managed service. So we structure the agreements accordingly. And really, it's a matter of working with whichever model or way of providing service that the MSP wants to work with, making sure that they've got the right sorts of contracts to support that. So yeah, we do definitely see differences. It's not that everyone moves and adapts in the same speed, but there are certainly trends. So when people start asking for a different type of model for a managed services agreement, we then start seeing others asking for the same thing as well.
Yeah, there's lots of chatting always going on between MSPs, so you sort of get an idea, it proves it works, and you sort of see it flood the community.
That's right.
But yeah, so really interesting point you make that actually the stack, if you were aiming for a single price solution now, has so many different components that it's very difficult to get one agreement for all of those. Although that doesn't necessarily stop the MSP from a sales perspective presenting it as a singular solution from a price or a budget perspective, and then so this was going to cost £300, for example, but here's free £100 agreements. Maybe do you see that?
Yeah, well, I think that it's important to let the customer see into the different types of services, and in effect to put a boundary around each of the services so that the customer is not, blindly accepting here's the service and here's the price per month, but actually breaking down what we call the barrier of expertise that otherwise exists between the MSP and the customer. And what I mean by that is, the customers get a perspective of the MSP and their skills, experience, expertise, and they trust them, which is great. That trust is important. In fact, it's essential, but the trust alone will cause problems. So allowing the customer in and seeing, to a greater level, what are the services that you're providing, what's included, what's the reliance on third-party services looking like, not only what you're reselling, but, you're going to put something on their devices and on what basis, what's going on there. And so breaking down, deliberately and consciously breaking down that barrier of expertise so that the customer has a greater understanding going in and can't blindly then have assumptions and expectations that don't line up with what you would want.
So what I'm seeing in my mind as a way of reconciling perhaps the demand for simplicity that a client and an MSP might want to exercise from a sales perspective, and then the education of the client, and then the legal and commercial implications. So almost if you had listed, and you can just click to expand at each level. So this service includes Microsoft, it includes a cyber solution, it includes data integrity, business continuity, and you click on it, and then that reveals and by the way, we're doing this with third party X, and their terms and conditions are going to be mirrored, and you go here to see that, and that sort of model? Do you see
Well,
that?
there's, the level of granularity needs to be assessed in light of the risks, shall we say, and it's not necessarily the case that we advocate, or recommend that an MSP would share all the details with the customer in their contract about, which endpoint protection vendor they're using. Again, you want to retain flexibility. So you could do that, but you could choose not to and still have, an appropriate level of clarity around that.
Got it. Yeah, interesting. We could probably spend another 3 hours for this. But we're pretty much on our time budget for this episode. It's been really interesting talking to you. Around this time, we offer our guest a shameless plug. So if anyone wants to carry on that conversation, maybe not for another 3 hours, how best to get hold of you?
Okay, so they could go to our site at itagree.com and very welcome to schedule a call there. And that'd probably be the best way. We're very happy to have discussions with any MSPs.
Very good. And not to date the recording of this episode, but this might actually come out after you've been visiting the UK in October. But yeah, we look forward to hopefully catching up with you then and continuing the ongoing debate about how legal is such an important topic for MSPs, and look forward to seeing you at forthcoming events. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to talk with you.
Thank you, Em.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Daniel.